June 7th, 1954. Morning light filters through the curtains of a modest, semi-detached house in Wilmslow, Cheshire. The housekeeper arrives at her usual time. She knocks. No answer. She uses her key. The hallway smells faintly of almonds, a smell she doesn't recognize, doesn't understand. She walks upstairs and opens the bedroom door. Alan Turing lies in his bed, 41 years old, foam dried at the corners of his mouth. On the nightstand sits a half-eaten apple. In the room next door, glass apparatus for gold-plating experiments, chemicals arranged on a bench, potassium cyanide. The police will arrive. The coroner will rule suicide. The apple will never be tested. His mother will spend the rest of her life insisting it was an accident, that her son was careless with his chemistry, that he would never have done this deliberately. But the verdict will stand. 2 years earlier, Alan Turing had been a Fellow of the Royal Society, recognized as one of Britain's most brilliant mathematicians. He had work he loved, problems that consumed him, a future that seemed to stretch endlessly forward. Then he made a mistake. He reported a burglary to the police. During the investigation, they discovered he was having a relationship with a 19-year-old man named Arnold Murray. Under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, homosexual acts between men were classified as gross indecency. The penalty was up to 2 years of hard labor. Turing was given a choice, prison or chemical castration. He chose the latter, a year of estrogen injections that would render him impotent, cause him to develop breasts, destroy his security clearance, and end his ability to work on classified projects. The state he had served, the nation whose survival he had helped secure, prosecuted him for the crime of loving men. The question that haunts everyone who studies his death is simple and impossible. Why? Why would a man of such brilliance, with so much still to give, with problems still unsolved and questions still burning in his mind, choose to end his life? Or did he choose it at all? Was it deliberate self-destruction or careless accident? The apple suggests one narrative, Snow White, the poisoned fruit, the dramatic gesture. The chemistry apparatus suggests another, a man absorbed in his experiments, inhaling cyanide fumes without realizing the danger until too late. We will never know. The mystery remains, like so many mysteries in Turing's life, tantalizingly close to resolution but forever out of reach. But there is another question, one that matters more than the manner of his death. How does a nation treat a man who saves it? What does it mean to be indispensable to your country's survival and then be destroyed by that same country? This is the paradox at the heart of Alan Turing's life. The man who helped win the Second World War, who laid the foundations for the computer age, who asked whether machines could think and what it meant to be human, and who was prosecuted, chemically castrated and driven to his death by the very institutions he had served. The story you think you know about Alan Turing is probably wrong. Not entirely wrong, but wrong in ways that matter. You've heard that he single-handedly broke the Enigma code and won the war for Britain. You've heard that he was a lone genius working in isolation, that his brilliance was so extraordinary it defied comprehension. You've heard that he was forgotten after the war, that his contributions went unrecognized until decades later. None of this is quite true. The real story is more complex, more human, and in some ways more impressive than the myth. Alan Turing did not break Enigma alone. He was one mathematician among thousands working at Bletchley Park. Polish cryptanalysts had broken early versions of Enigma years before Turing arrived. Gordon Welchman made crucial improvements to the machines that decoded German messages. Dilly Knox led the team that Turing joined. Joan Clark worked beside him, contributing insights that shaped the work. The idea of the solitary genius is romantic, but it's a distortion. Turing's greatness was not that he worked alone, it was that he knew how to collaborate, how to take abstract mathematical concepts and make them useful, how to build machines with his own hands when necessary. But before we dive deeper into what actually happened at Bletchley Park and why the popular version of events misses so much of what made Turing extraordinary, I want to ask you for something. If this story interests you, if you're curious about where this is going, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It means more to me than you might think. And I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from people across the globe who share this fascination with history's most complicated figures. Now let's go back. Back before Bletchley, before Enigma, before the war. Back to a time when Alan Turing was just a boy trying to make sense of a world that didn't seem designed for someone like him. Alan Matheson Turing was born on June 23, 1912 in Maida Vale, London, but he was not raised in London. His parents, Julius and Ethel Turing, were members of the colonial administrative class. His father worked for the Indian Civil Service, stationed in British India, and his mother had grown up there as well, the daughter of the chief engineer of the Madras Railways. This was the world that shaped the Turings, a world of empire, of service to the crown, of rigid social hierarchies, and clear expectations about what a proper English gentleman should be and do. But Alan and his older brother John were not raised by their parents. Julius and Ethel returned to India when Alan was still an infant, and the boys were left in England, passed between foster families and boarding schools. This was not unusual for colonial families. The assumption was that England provided a better, more civilized upbringing than India could offer. But it meant that Alan's childhood was defined by absence, by the lack of parental warmth, by a sense of being perpetually between homes, never quite belonging anywhere. The separation happened when Alan was barely a year old. He was too young to remember his parents leaving, too young to understand why the people who were supposed to care for him kept changing. His first foster family, the Wards, lived in St. Leonards-on-Sea, a seaside town on the south coast. Mrs. Ward was kind but distant, running what amounted to a small boarding house for children of colonial families. Alan learned early that showing too much emotion was discouraged, that tears were something to be hidden, that attachment was dangerous because everyone eventually left. His brother John, 4 years older, was both protector and tormentor. John understood the rules of their strange upbringing in ways Alan couldn't yet grasp. He knew how to behave at formal dinners with the ward's other guests, how to make small talk with adults, how to navigate the social expectations that seemed to baffle Alan. But John also resented being responsible for his younger brother, resented the way Alan's oddness reflected on both of them. When Alan asked too many questions about why the moon changed shape or where numbers ended, John would tell him to be quiet, to stop embarrassing them both. Their parents visited rarely, once every year or two, when Julius and Ethel returned to England on leave. These visits were awkward affairs. Alan barely knew these people who claimed to be his mother and father. They spoke of a place called India that existed only in stories, showed photographs of houses and servants, and landscapes that might as well have been on the moon. They brought gifts, carved wooden elephants, brightly coloured fabrics, books about distant places, and then they left again, returning to their real life, while Alan and John remained behind in the grey English climate, passed from one temporary home to another. At age 6, he was enrolled at Hazelhurst Preparatory School. The headmistress noted that he was an unusual child, intensely focused on whatever captured his interest, but utterly uninterested in anything that bored him. He struggled with handwriting and spelling, subjects that required rote conformity rather than independent thinking. His handwriting was atrocious, a source of constant frustration to his teachers. The letters slanted in different directions, words ran together, entire sentences became illegible tangles of ink. He couldn't seem to understand why it mattered how the letters looked as long as the meaning was clear. but he showed early signs of mathematical brilliance. At age 8, he was already working with complex numbers, teaching himself concepts far beyond what was expected at his age. He would spend hours working through problems in his head, filling notebooks with calculations that his teachers couldn't follow. When his mathematics instructor asked him to explain how he'd arrived at an answer, Alan would look confused. It was obvious, wasn't it? Why did he need to show his work when the logic was self-evident? One incident from Hazelhurst captures the essential Alan, even at that young age. The school went on a nature walk, and Alan became fascinated by the patterns in a beehive. While other boys were playing games or collecting leaves for their biology projects, Alan sat motionless, watching bees enter and exit the hive, counting them, tracking their movements. He missed lunch. He missed the walk back. When teachers finally found him still crouched by the beehive, he looked up and asked whether bees knew mathematics. Did they calculate distances? Did they use geometry to build those perfect hexagonal cells? The teacher told him to stop asking silly questions and hurry up. But Alan kept thinking about those bees, about the mathematics hidden in their behavior, about intelligence that didn't look like human intelligence but was intelligence nonetheless. In 1926, at 14, he was sent to Sherborne School, a traditional English public school in Dorset. Sherborne's curriculum emphasized classical education, Latin, Greek, literature, history, and treated science and mathematics as secondary concerns, useful perhaps for boys who weren't quite clever enough for the classical track. Turing hated it. The emphasis on rote memorization, on conformity to established forms, on knowing what the ancients had written rather than discovering new things, it all felt suffocating. His reports from Sherborne are filled with complaints from teachers. He doesn't pay attention in class. His handwriting is atrocious. He focuses too much on mathematics and neglects other subjects. One teacher wrote that if Turing wanted to be a scientist, he was wasting his time at a public school. The first day at Sherborne set the tone for everything that followed. A general strike had disrupted the trains, and most students arrived late or didn't arrive at all on the first day of term. Alan, determined not to miss the start of school, rode his bicycle 60 miles from Southampton to Sherborne. He arrived filthy, exhausted, his clothes soaked with rain, his hands raw from gripping the handlebars. The local newspaper ran a story about the dedicated student who wouldn't let a general strike interfere with his education. But at the school itself, the reaction was different. The other boys thought he was showing off. The masters thought he was being dramatic. No one seemed to understand that for Alan, it was simply logical. He needed to be at school on the first day. The trains weren't running. Therefore, he would bicycle. The fact that it was 60 miles through bad weather didn't change the logic. Sherborne operated on a brutal hierarchy. Older boys had almost unlimited authority over younger ones. Fagging, the system where junior boys served as servants for seniors, was still in full practice. Alan was expected to polish boots, make tea, run errands, and accept punishment if he failed to meet expectations. The social dynamics were vicious. Boys who didn't fit in, who couldn't play rugby well, or who cared more about books than sports, were targets for mockery and worse. Alan fit none of the approved molds. He was physically awkward, uninterested in team sports, obsessed with subjects that the other boys found boring. He became a target. The expectation was clear. Alan was supposed to become a gentleman, a member of the administrative or professional class, someone who would serve the empire in some respectable capacity. Mathematical ability was fine as a hobby, but it wasn't a proper career for someone of his social position. He was supposed to learn Latin and Greek, develop social graces, make the right connections, and eventually take up a post in the civil service or the clergy or law. That was the path laid out for him. But then in 1928, something happened that changed everything. At Sherborne, Alan became friends with a boy named Christopher Morecambe. Christopher was everything Alan wasn't, socially graceful where Alan was awkward, conventionally handsome where Alan was unremarkable, effortlessly excellent at both classics and sciences. But Christopher saw something in Alan that few others did. He recognized the quality of Alan's mind, the way he approached problems from unexpected angles, the sheer intensity of his intellectual curiosity. They became inseparable. They studied together, worked through mathematical problems together, pushed each other to think more deeply. For Alan, who had spent most of his life feeling like he didn't quite fit anywhere, Christopher's friendship was transformative. Here was someone who understood him, who valued what he valued, who made him feel less alone in the world. Their friendship began tentatively. Christopher was a year ahead of Alan, and under Sherborne's rigid hierarchy, older and younger boys weren't supposed to form close relationships, but they kept encountering each other in the science building, both of them drawn to the laboratory when they should have been at rugby practice or participating in military drills. Christopher was working on astronomy, trying to calculate the orbit of a comet. Alan was experimenting with chemistry, trying to extract iodine from seaweed using methods he'd read about in a scientific journal. They started talking about their respective projects. Those conversations stretched from minutes to hours. Christopher did something radical. He treated Alan as an intellectual equal, not as a younger boy who needed instruction, not as a social inferior who should defer to his betters, but as someone whose ideas were worth taking seriously. When Alan proposed an unconventional solution to a mathematical problem, Christopher didn't dismiss it. He worked through the logic, found the flaws, suggested improvements. When they disagreed about whether a particular theorem could be proved a certain way, they would spend days working through the implications, passing notebooks back and forth, building on each other's insights. They discovered they shared a fascination with the relationship between mathematics and the physical world. Christopher was reading about quantum mechanics, about how the behavior of atoms seemed to follow mathematical rules that made no intuitive sense. Alan was thinking about whether you could reduce all of chemistry to mathematics, whether there was some fundamental equation that governed how molecules formed and broke apart. They talked about Einstein's theory of relativity, about whether space and time were really unified, about what it meant that light had a speed limit. These were not conversations that teenage boys at an English boarding school were supposed to be having. They were supposed to be talking about rugby scores and holiday plans and which girls they fancied from the local town. It was more than friendship. Alan fell in love with Christopher Morecambe, not in a way he fully understood or could articulate, given the time and place and the laws that criminalized such feelings, but the emotional reality was undeniable. Christopher gave Alan something he had never had before, a sense of intellectual partnership, of being truly seen by another person. Whether Christopher understood the depth of Alan's feelings is impossible to know. He was affectionate in the way that English schoolboys of that era could be, formal, reserved, but genuinely warm within those constraints. He invited Alan to his family home for holidays. He introduced Alan to his mother, who welcomed the awkward younger boy with a kindness that Alan had rarely experienced. They made plans together. They would both go to Cambridge. They would study mathematics. They would work on problems that mattered, that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. The future seemed to stretch out before them, full of possibility. Christopher talked about doing original research in physics, about understanding the fundamental nature of matter. Alan thought he might work on the foundations of mathematics, on understanding what made proof possible. They imagined sharing rooms at Cambridge, continuing their conversations, building a life around the work they both loved. In January 1930, Christopher won a scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge. Alan was still preparing for his own entrance exams, hoping to follow Christopher there in the fall. But Christopher had been ill over Christmas. Not seriously, it seemed, just a bad cold. He recovered, or appeared to recover, and returned to school. On February 13, 1930, Christopher Morcom collapsed. He was rushed home. Doctors discovered that what everyone thought was a simple winter illness was actually bovine tuberculosis. He had contracted it years earlier from infected milk, and the bacteria had been slowly destroying his body from within. There was nothing they could do. 6 days later, on February 13th, Christopher died. He was 18 years old. The news reached Alan at Sherborne. He was in mathematics class when the headmaster came to the door, spoke quietly to the instructor, and then asked to see Alan in his office. Alan knew immediately. The headmaster's face, the careful way he guided Alan down the corridor, the tone of voice when he said there had been tragic news from the Morcom family, all of it confirmed what Alan already understood before the words were spoken. Christopher was dead. Alan was devastated. He had lost the first person who had ever truly understood him, the person who made him feel like his mind and his interests and his way of being in the world were valuable. He wrote to Christopher's mother a correspondence that would continue for years. In those letters he tried to make sense of what had happened, tried to understand where Christopher had gone. Did the mind survive the death of the body? Was consciousness something that could exist independently of physical matter? Or had Christopher simply ceased to exist, all that brilliance and potential snuffed out in an instant? Mrs. Morcom responded to Alan's letters with a tenderness that his own mother had never shown. She sent him Christopher's star charts, his notebooks, his calculations about the comet's orbit. She told Alan that Christopher had spoken highly of him, had valued their friendship deeply. She invited Alan to visit, to see Christopher's room, to take whatever books or instruments he wanted as keepsakes. These gestures meant everything to Alan. He kept Christopher's notebooks for the rest of his life, returning to them again and again, as if the calculations on those pages could bring Christopher back. These questions became central to Alan's intellectual life. He threw himself into his studies with renewed intensity. He won a scholarship to King's College, Cambridge, not Trinity, where Christopher would have gone, but King's, where the emphasis was more on mathematics and less on classics. He arrived at Cambridge in 1931, still grieving, still trying to understand what it meant that someone so vital could simply vanish from the world. At Cambridge, Alan found an environment that suited him in ways Sherborne never had. King's College had a reputation for tolerating, even celebrating, eccentricity. It was a place where being brilliant mattered more than having good social skills, where unconventional thinking was valued rather than suppressed. Alan thrived. He studied under mathematicians who recognized his talent, who pushed him to think more rigorously, who introduced him to the deep foundational questions that were consuming mathematics in the 1930s. The Cambridge that Alan entered was a world apart from Sherborne. Here, intellectual curiosity wasn't something to be hidden or apologized for. It was the entire point. He attended lectures by luminaries like G.H. Hardy and John von Neumann when they visited. He joined the Moral Sciences Club, where philosophers and mathematicians debated questions about logic, language, and the nature of knowledge. He discovered that there were other people like him, people who thought mathematics was beautiful, who got excited about abstract problems that had no practical application, who cared more about understanding the fundamental nature of reality than about fitting into conventional society. King's College was also more tolerant of homosexuality than most institutions in 1930s Britain. It wasn't openly discussed, the laws were still in force, the social stigma still powerful, but there was an unspoken understanding that some men loved other men, and as long as you were discreet As long as you contributed to the intellectual life of the college, you would not be persecuted. Alan began to understand that what he had felt for Christopher Morcom was not unique, was not a personal failing, was something that other men experienced. He remained private about his sexuality, but he was no longer completely alone with it. This was a period of crisis in the field of mathematics. For centuries, mathematicians had believed that mathematics was a solid, logical structure, that every mathematical truth could be proven through rigorous deduction from first principles. But in the early 20th century, that certainty began to crumble. Paradoxes emerged that seemed to undermine the entire edifice. Bertrand Russell had shown that naive set theory led to contradictions. David Hilbert had proposed a program to put mathematics on secure foundations by proving that arithmetic was both consistent and complete, that every true statement could be proven within the system. But in 1931, just as Alan was arriving at Cambridge, Kurt Gödel had published a proof that shattered Hilbert's program. Gödel showed that any sufficiently powerful formal system would contain true statements that could not be proven within that system. Mathematics, it turned out, was fundamentally incomplete. Alan was fascinated by these foundational questions. What did it mean for a statement to be provable? What did it mean for something to be computable? Could you define, in precise terms, what it meant for a problem to be solvable? These weren't just abstract philosophical puzzles. They were questions about the nature of human thought, about what minds could and couldn't do. In 1935, one of Alan's professors, Max Newman, delivered a series of lectures on the foundations of mathematics. Newman explained Hilbert's Entscheidungsproblem, the decision problem. Hilbert had asked whether there was a general method that could determine, for any mathematical statement, whether that statement was provable or not. Was there an algorithm, a mechanical procedure that could solve all mathematical problems? Alan became obsessed with the question, but to answer it, he first had to define what he meant by a mechanical procedure, by a method. What did it mean for something to be computable? This was a problem that no one had solved precisely. People had an intuitive sense of what computation meant, following a set of rules, performing operations step by step, but no one had formalized it rigorously. Alan began working on the problem in the winter of 1935. He went for long runs through the countryside around Cambridge, thinking through the logic of what a computing machine would need to do. He imagined a person performing a calculation, following a procedure. What would that person need? Paper to write on, symbols to write, rules for when to write which symbols. The ability to look at what had been written and decide what to do next. The inspiration came during one of those long runs across the meadows near Grantchester. Alan was thinking about what a human computer did, and in 1935, computer meant a person who performed calculations by hand, following fixed rules. He watched the patterns of his own thinking as he mentally worked through a mathematical problem while running. There was a mechanical quality to it: check a condition, make a decision, perform an operation, check the result, decide what to do next. Could you reduce all of thought to this kind of mechanical process? Could you build a machine that followed the same logical steps? What made Alan's approach revolutionary was its simplicity. Other mathematicians had tried to define computation in terms of complex formalisms, elaborate systems of rules. Alan stripped everything away until he reached the bare minimum. What was the simplest possible device that could compute anything computable? Not a practical machine that you would actually build, but a theoretical construct that captured the essence of what computation meant. He imagined himself as that human computer, working with the most basic tools imaginable. You have a strip of paper, infinitely long, divided into squares. You have a pencil that can write or erase symbols. You can look at one square at a time. You can move left or right along the paper. And you have a set of instructions. If you see this symbol and you're in this state of mind, Then write that symbol, move this direction, and change to that state of mind. That was all. Everything else, all the complexity of human thought, all the sophistication of mathematical reasoning, had to emerge from those simple operations. He stripped this process down to its absolute essentials. Imagine, he thought, an infinite tape divided into squares. Each square can hold a single symbol, say a 0 or a 1 or a blank. Imagine a machine that can read one square at a time, write a new symbol on that square, and move one square left or right. The machine has a set of internal states, and based on what symbol it reads and what state it's in, it follows rules that tell it what symbol to write, which direction to move, and what state to enter next. It was elegant, it was minimal, and it was powerful enough to capture anything that could be computed by following a fixed procedure. Alan worked through example after example, showing how his simple machine could perform addition, multiplication, more complex operations. He designed specific Turing machines for specific tasks, working out the state transitions on paper, verifying that the logic was sound. Each machine was a set of rules, a table showing what to do for each combination of current state and current symbol, simple in principle but capable of arbitrary complexity in practice. This was the Turing machine, not a physical device but a mathematical concept, a formal definition of what it meant to compute. Alan showed that any computation that could be performed by following a fixed procedure could be performed by one of these machines. And then he did something remarkable. He showed that there was a universal Turing machine, a single machine that could simulate any other Turing machine if you gave it the right instructions. This was the theoretical foundation for the modern computer, a single machine capable of running any program. And then he used this concept to answer Hilbert's question. He proved that the Entscheidungs problem was unsolvable. There was no general method for determining whether a mathematical statement was provable. He did this by showing that the halting problem was undecidable. There was no algorithm that could determine for any Turing machine and any input whether that machine would eventually halt or run forever. This meant that some mathematical questions were fundamentally unsolvable, not because humans weren't clever enough, but because no algorithmic procedure could answer them. Alan wrote up his proof and submitted it for publication in 1936. It was called On Computable Numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungs problem. It was one of the most important papers in the history of mathematics and computer science, though hardly anyone recognized it at the time. In fact, someone else had reached similar conclusions at almost exactly the same moment. Alonzo Church at Princeton had developed a different formal system called the lambda calculus and had used it to prove the same result. Church's paper was published slightly earlier than Alan's. Max Newman suggested that Alan go to Princeton to study with Church. In September 1936, Alan sailed for America. He was 24 years old, already responsible for a foundational contribution to mathematical logic, but still unknown outside a small circle of specialists. At Princeton, Alan studied under Church and interacted with some of the greatest mathematicians of the era. John von Neumann was there, developing game theory and thinking about the architecture of computing machines. Alan attended lectures, worked on his PhD, and refined his ideas. Von Neumann recognized the importance of Alan's work and offered him a position at Princeton after he completed his degree. It was an attractive offer. Princeton was the center of mathematical research in the world, and staying there would have meant working with the best minds in the field. Princeton was both exhilarating and alienating for Alan. The intellectual environment was extraordinary. He found himself in conversations with people who understood his work, who could follow his reasoning, who asked questions that pushed him to think more deeply. Von Neumann, in particular, was fascinated by the universal Turing machine. He saw immediately that Alan had done something profound. He had shown that a single machine could simulate any other machine, that computation was a unified concept rather than a collection of special cases. Von Neumann would later use these ideas in his own work on computer architecture, developing what became known as the von Neumann architecture, a stored program computer that could run different programs without being physically rebuilt. But America felt strange to Alan. The social conventions were different, the pace of life was different, even the academic culture was different. At Cambridge, eccentricity was tolerated, even expected. At Princeton, there was more pressure to conform, to be professionally polished, to network and make connections. Alan struggled with this. He was still awkward in social situations, still prone to saying exactly what he thought without considering how it would be received. He spent long hours alone in his room or in the library, working through mathematical problems, writing papers, thinking. He also started thinking about practical applications of his theoretical work. If you could build a universal machine, what would it look like? What kind of physical components would you need? How would you store instructions? How would you represent numbers and symbols? These weren't just abstract questions, they were engineering problems. Alan began sketching designs, thinking about circuits and relays, imagining how you might actually construct a computing device based on his theoretical principles. This was something new for him. He had always been a pure mathematician, working with abstract concepts. But now he was thinking like an engineer, trying to make theory concrete. The other project Alan worked on at Princeton was cryptography. He designed an electrical multiplier and built it with his own hands, soldering circuits together in the laboratory. He was trying to create a device that could encrypt speech, that could scramble voice conversations so that only someone with the right key could understand them. The British government was interested in this work. They could see war coming, could see that secure communications would be vital. But Alan's approach was too theoretical, too complicated for practical use. The device he built worked in principle but was too slow and unreliable for real-world application. Still, it showed that Alan was thinking about cryptography, about codes and ciphers, and the mathematics of secrecy, years before he arrived at Bletchley Park. But Alan said no to von Neumann's offer. He had spent 2 years in America, and he was ready to go home. In the summer of 1938, he returned to Cambridge to take up a fellowship at King's College. He had plans to continue working on mathematical logic, to explore the implications of his work on computability, to pursue the questions that had consumed him since his undergraduate days. He couldn't have known that his time working on pure mathematics was almost over, that the next chapter of his life would be defined by war and codes and machines that had to work not in theory, but in practice, under pressure, with lives depending on them. But the world was changing in ways that would disrupt those plans. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria. In September, it took the Sudetenland. In March 1939, it occupied Czechoslovakia. War was coming, and everyone knew it. The British government was preparing, mobilizing resources, recruiting people with specialized skills for the war effort. And Alan Turing, with his mind for logic and his ability to think about problems in ways no one else could, was exactly the kind of person they needed. In 1938, while still working at Cambridge, Alan had begun part-time work for the Government Code and Cipher School, the British agency responsible for cryptanalysis. He attended training courses on code-breaking techniques, learning the basics of how encrypted messages could be attacked. The work interested him. It was a different kind of puzzle than the foundational questions he had been pursuing, but it required the same kind of rigorous logical thinking. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. On September 4th, Alan reported to Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire, that had been requisitioned by the government code and cipher school. He was assigned to Hut 8, the section responsible for breaking German naval Enigma. His war work had begun. To understand what Alan was about to attempt, you need to understand the Enigma machine. It was an encryption device used by the German military to encode messages. It looked like a typewriter with extra components, rotors that scrambled the letters, a plug board that swapped pairs of letters before and after the scrambling. When you pressed a key, an electrical signal would pass through the plug board, then through the rotors, then bounce off a reflector, and pass back through the rotors and plug board in reverse, lighting up a different letter. The operator would write down the lit letter, and that was the encrypted text. The brilliance of Enigma was that the rotor positions changed with every letter typed, so the same letter would be encrypted differently each time. And the number of possible settings was astronomically large. The plug board alone had trillions of possible configurations, and the rotors added even more. Breaking Enigma meant figuring out which of those trillions of settings had been used to encrypt a particular message. It seemed impossible, but it wasn't impossible, because the Poles had already done it. This is the part of the story that gets left out of most popular accounts. Polish mathematicians Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Cygalski had been working on Enigma since the early 1930s. In 1932, Rejewski had reverse-engineered the wiring of the Enigma rotors and developed a method for finding the daily settings. The Poles built machines called bombas, electromechanical devices that could test possible rotor positions much faster than a human could. By the late 1930s, they were regularly reading German Enigma traffic. But in 1938, the Germans made Enigma more complex, adding more rotors and changing the indicator procedures. The Polish methods started failing. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Polish cryptanalysts fled to France, and before they left, they shared everything they knew with the British and French. They gave the British the rotor wirings, the bomber designs, the methods they had developed. Without the Polish contribution, the British would have been starting from scratch. Instead, they were building on years of Polish work. This is not to diminish what Alan did at Bletchley, it's to properly contextualize it. Alan didn't invent the idea of breaking Enigma. He didn't work in isolation. He was joining an ongoing effort, building on methods that others had pioneered, working as part of a team. What he contributed was a different approach to the problem, a way of thinking about it that drew on his work in mathematical logic, and a willingness to combine theoretical brilliance with practical engineering. When Alan arrived at Bletchley, the head of Hut 8 was Dilly Knox, a veteran codebreaker who had been working on Enigma for years. Knox was brilliant but difficult, obsessed with solving problems through pure intuition rather than systematic method. Alan respected Knox but worked in a different way. He wanted to formalize the attack on Enigma, to turn it into a mathematical problem that could be solved mechanically. Bletchley Park itself was a strange place to wage a war. The Victorian mansion sat on a small estate, surrounded by makeshift wooden huts, where the actual work happened. By 1942, nearly 10,000 people would be working there, but in September 1939, when Alan arrived, it was still relatively small, a few hundred people, mostly academics and civil servants, trying to figure out how to organize a code-breaking operation on an unprecedented scale. The culture at Bletchley was unlike anything in the regular military. People worked in shifts around the clock. They wore civilian clothes. They addressed each other by first names regardless of rank or social position. There was an atmosphere of intellectual intensity mixed with absurdity, people solving life-or-death puzzles while also participating in amateur theatrical productions, forming chess clubs, gossiping about who was sleeping with whom. It was simultaneously the most serious work imaginable and a strange kind of summer camp for brilliant misfits. Alan fit in better at Bletchley than he had anywhere since Cambridge. His eccentricities, which had made him a target at Sherborne, were unremarkable here. Everyone was odd in some way. There was the mathematician who rode a unicycle between huts, the linguist who conducted entire conversations in ancient Greek, the chess master who could play 12 games simultaneously while blindfolded. Alan's habit of chaining his coffee mug to the radiator and wearing a gas mask while bicycling during pollen season didn't even register as particularly strange. The key insight was that Enigma had a flaw. Because of the way the reflector worked, no letter could ever be encrypted as itself. If you typed A, it could become any letter except A. This seemed like a minor detail, but it created patterns that could be exploited. If you had a guess about what part of the encrypted message said, a crib, in code-breaking terminology, you could use the fact that no letter matched itself to rule out huge numbers of possible rotor positions. Alan developed a statistical method for exploiting these patterns. He designed a machine, called the bomb, after the Polish bombus, but far more sophisticated, that would test rotor positions against a crib using the no-self-encryption property to eliminate impossible settings. The machine wouldn't give you the answer directly, but it would narrow down the possibilities to a manageable number that human cryptanalysts could then test. But Alan didn't design the bomb alone. Gordon Welchman, a mathematician working in Hut 6 on German Army and Air Force Enigma, made a crucial improvement. Welchman added a diagonal board to the bomb that dramatically increased its speed by using information about the plugboard settings. Without Welchman's enhancement, the bomb would have been far less effective. Alan and Welchman worked together to refine the design, arguing through technical problems, testing different configurations. They collaborated with Harold Doc Keane, an engineer from the British Tabulating Machine Company, who figured out how to actually build the device they had designed on paper. This was the reality of Bletchley, not lone geniuses working in isolation, but teams of specialists combining their expertise, building on each other's insights, turning abstract theory into working machines. The first bomb was installed at Bletchley in March 1940. It didn't work perfectly at first. There were technical problems, refinements that needed to be made. But by the summer of 1940, the system was operational. And then came the real test, breaking naval Enigma. The German Navy used a version of Enigma that was more secure than the Army and Air Force versions. It had different procedures, different rotor settings, and crucially, far fewer messages to work with, which made finding cribs much harder. For months, Hut 8 struggled. They could break some messages, but not consistently, not quickly enough to be useful. The breakthrough came in May 1941, not through Alan's mathematical brilliance, but through luck and courage. The British Navy captured a German submarine, U-110, and seized its Enigma machine and codebooks before the submarine's crew could destroy them. This gave Bletchley the key material they needed to break into naval Enigma. Suddenly, they could read German U-boat communications, track their positions, reroute convoys to avoid them. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had been going badly for Britain, began to turn. This is the moment in most tellings where Alan Turing becomes the hero who won the war. And there's truth to that story. The intelligence from naval Enigma was vital to Britain's survival. If the U-boats had continued sinking supply ships at the rate they were in 1940-1941, Britain would have been starved into submission. Breaking naval Enigma mattered enormously. But it wasn't Alan alone who did it. It was the 10,000 people working at Bletchley Park, the cryptanalysts, the machine operators, the clerks, the engineers who kept the bombs running, the intelligence analysts who turned decrypted messages into actionable information. It was the Navy crews who captured Enigma materials from German vessels. It was the Polish mathematicians who had laid the groundwork. Alan was a crucial part of this massive collective effort, but he was not the sole genius who won the war through his brilliance alone. Alan himself understood this. In 1941, when Hut 8 was struggling with resource shortages, he and several colleagues wrote directly to Winston Churchill, bypassing the bureaucracy to request more staff and more bombs. Churchill responded immediately with a memo. Action this day. Make sure they have all they want on extreme priority. Alan knew how to work within institutions, how to advocate for resources, how to make the case for why this work mattered. He wasn't a lone genius working in isolation, he was a skilled collaborator who understood how to get things done. By 1942, Enigma was being broken routinely. Bletchley was producing intelligence that shaped the course of the war, tracking U-boats, revealing German military plans, providing advance warning of attacks. Alan's role at Bletchley evolved. He was no longer working directly on Enigma but on other problems. He traveled to the United States to share cryptanalysis techniques with American codebreakers. He worked on a speech encryption project called Delilah. He consulted on various technical challenges. The war years at Bletchley were, in many ways, the most fulfilling period of Alan's life. He was surrounded by people who valued his intellect, who understood what he was trying to do, who shared his commitment to the work. He formed deep friendships with Joan Clark, a fellow cryptanalyst who would briefly become his fiancée, with other mathematicians and engineers who appreciated his unconventional approach. He was eccentric. Certainly, he chained his coffee mug to the radiator to prevent theft. He ran marathons in his spare time. He had a habit of explaining things in ways that assumed everyone else thought like he did. But at Bletchley, eccentricity was normal. Everyone there was a bit odd. It was a place where being brilliant mattered more than being conventional. In 1941, Alan proposed to Joan Clark. They had worked closely together in Hut 8, and he genuinely cared for her. But Alan knew something about himself that he couldn't hide, not even to make the relationship work. He told Joan that he had homosexual tendencies. This was not language Alan would have used comfortably. Homosexuality was not just illegal, but deeply stigmatized, spoken of in whispers or clinical euphemisms. But he told her because he knew it wasn't fair to marry her without being honest. Joan Clark was remarkable in her own right. She had come to Bletchley as one of the few women working in cryptanalysis proper, not just as a clerk or machine operator. She understood Enigma as well as anyone in Hut 8, contributed crucial insights to breaking new variants of the code, and earned respect in a field dominated by men. But she was paid less than her male colleagues, given a lower official title, and denied the recognition that men with equivalent contributions received. The official history of Bletchley would barely mention her name. Alan valued Joan's intellect and her companionship. They spent long evenings discussing mathematics, cryptanalysis, and philosophical questions about the nature of intelligence. They went on long walks in the countryside around Bletchley, talking through problems that had stalled, bouncing ideas off each other. Alan appreciated that Joan never treated him as odd or difficult. She simply accepted him as he was, eccentricities and all. When Alan proposed, he did so awkwardly, almost apologetically. He explained that he cared for her deeply, that he valued their partnership, but that he needed to be honest about something. He told her that he had always been attracted to men, that this wasn't something that would change, that he didn't know if he could be a proper husband in all the ways that society expected. He gave her every reason to refuse him. Joan said she didn't mind. She was willing to accept him as he was. She understood the constraints they were living under, understood that conventional marriage might not be possible, but was willing to try anyway. For a few weeks they were engaged. They told their colleagues at Bletchley, made tentative plans for after the war, but Alan broke off the engagement anyway. He couldn't do it, couldn't pretend to be something he wasn't, couldn't build a life on that foundation. It wasn't fair to Joan, no matter how understanding she was. It wasn't fair to himself. They had a painful conversation in which Alan tried to explain why he couldn't go through with it, and Joan tried to hide how hurt she was. They remained friends and colleagues, but the possibility of a conventional life together ended. The war ended in May 1945. Alan was awarded the OBE, Officer of the Order of the British Empire, for his wartime services, though the details of what he had done remained classified. He could not tell anyone outside of Bletchley what he had spent the war doing. As far as his family and most of his friends knew, he had been doing some kind of unspecified government work. The full story of Bletchley Park would not be revealed for decades. Alan faced the question that everyone faces at the end of a great collective effort. What now? He was 33 years old. The work he had been doing for 6 years was over. He had to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. Before the war, Alan had been a pure mathematician, working on foundational questions in logic. But the war had changed him. He had spent 6 years building machines, solving practical problems, seeing how abstract theory could be applied to urgent real-world needs. He didn't want to go back to pure mathematics. He wanted to build something. In 1946, Alan joined the National Physical Laboratory in London. He was hired to design a computer, an actual physical machine that would implement the ideas he had laid out in his 1936 paper. He called it the Automatic Computing Engine, or ACE. It was an ambitious design, far ahead of anything else being attempted at the time. Alan envisioned a machine with a large high-speed memory, capable of running complex programs, general purpose in the way his universal Turing machine had been. But the National Physical Laboratory was a bureaucratic institution, slow-moving and cautious. Alan submitted his design in 1946 and waited for approval. And waited. And waited. The project was delayed by funding problems, by administrative inertia, by resistance from people who didn't understand what he was trying to do. Alan grew frustrated. He had spent the war working at breakneck speed, where decisions were made quickly and resources were allocated without endless committees and reviews. The peacetime world felt suffocatingly slow. The contrast was jarring. At Bletchley, when they needed something, they got it. Churchill had personally intervened to ensure they had resources. Decisions were made in hours, not months. People trusted each other's expertise, but at NPL, every decision required approval from multiple committees. People who didn't understand computing questioned why they needed such an expensive machine. There were concerns about whether it was proper for a scientific laboratory to be building what looked like an adding machine. Alan tried to explain that this wasn't an adding machine, it was a universal computing device, something fundamentally new. But the administrators didn't understand, and they weren't particularly interested in understanding. Alan grew increasingly isolated at NPL. He missed the camaraderie of Bletchley, the sense of shared purpose, the intellectual excitement. He missed working with people who understood what he was trying to do without needing everything explained in excruciating detail. He became short-tempered in meetings, dismissive of objections he considered stupid. His colleagues found him difficult. The project dragged on. In 1948, Alan left the National Physical Laboratory. A smaller version of ACE would eventually be built, but not under his direction. He moved to the University of Manchester, where Max Newman, his old professor from Cambridge, had established a computing laboratory. Manchester was building its own computer, and Alan joined the team. He was no longer the lead designer, but he was free to think about the theoretical implications of what these machines could do. And that's when Alan returned to the question that had haunted him since Christopher Morcom's death. What is the nature of mind? Can intelligence exist independently of biological matter? If you could build a machine that behaved intelligently, would that machine be thinking? In 1950, Alan published a paper in the philosophy journal Mind. It was called Computing, Machinery and Intelligence, and it opened with the most direct question imaginable. Can machines think? Alan argued that this question, as stated, was too vague to be useful. What did it mean to think? How would you know if a machine was thinking? Instead of trying to define thought, Alan proposed a test. Imagine you're communicating with something via text. You can't see it or hear it. You can only read its responses to your questions. If you can't tell whether you're talking to a human or a machine, then for all practical purposes, the machine is thinking. This became known as the Turing test, and it remains one of the most influential ideas in artificial intelligence. Alan wasn't claiming that this test captured everything about consciousness or intelligence. He was proposing a pragmatic way to approach the question. If a machine could convince a human interrogator that it was human, then arguing about whether it was really thinking became a semantic game rather than a meaningful question. But Alan went further. He addressed objections. What about creativity? Could machines be creative? What about emotions? Could machines have feelings? What about free will? Could machines make genuine choices? Alan systematically worked through these objections, arguing that there was no reason in principle why machines couldn't do any of these things. The human brain, after all, was a kind of machine, a biological one, but a machine nonetheless, operating according to physical laws. If intelligence emerged from the physical processes of the brain, then there was no reason it couldn't emerge from the physical processes of an artificial computer. This was radical for 1950. Computers at that time were massive, room-filling machines that could barely do arithmetic. The idea that they might someday be intelligent, that they might pass as human in conversation, seemed like pure fantasy. But Alan wasn't fantasizing. He was extrapolating from principles, thinking about what would be possible if computers continued to develop. He predicted that by the year 2000, machines would be able to play the imitation game well enough to fool an average interrogator 30% of the time. It was a specific, testable prediction. And he was wrong, or at least premature. By 2000, no machine could reliably pass the Turing test in open-ended conversation. But in 2024, large language models like GPT-4 can hold conversations that many people find difficult to distinguish from human responses. Alan's timeline was off, but his fundamental insight was correct. There is no magic barrier preventing machines from exhibiting intelligent behavior. The other project Alan pursued at Manchester was completely different but equally ahead of its time. He became interested in morphogenesis, the question of how organisms develop from single cells into complex structures with patterns and forms. How did a zebra get its stripes? How did a leopard get its spots? What mechanisms could generate regular patterns in biological systems? Alan approached this as a mathematical problem. He developed a model based on reaction diffusion systems, two chemicals that diffuse through space and react with each other in specific ways. He showed that even simple rules could generate complex patterns that looked remarkably like those found in nature. It was a pioneering work in mathematical biology, published in 1952 as The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis. Alan was doing this work in the early 1950s before the structure of DNA was discovered, before molecular biology became a field. He was thinking about how information in genes could be translated into physical form, how biological computation worked. It was another example of Alan seeing connections that no one else saw, applying mathematical thinking to problems that seemed far removed from mathematics. But while Alan was working on these questions, his personal life was becoming increasingly difficult. He was living alone in a house in Wilmslow outside Manchester. He was 40 years old, unmarried, with few close relationships. His homosexuality, which he had always known about but had kept hidden, was becoming harder to hide. In post-war Britain, the laws against homosexuality were being enforced more aggressively. There was paranoia about security risks. Gay men were seen as vulnerable to blackmail, as potential spies who could be turned by foreign intelligence services. The Cold War was intensifying, and anyone who didn't fit the mold of conventional respectability was suspect. In January 1952, Alan met a 19-year-old man named Arnold Murray outside a cinema in Manchester. They began a relationship. Alan invited Arnold to his house. By all accounts, it was not a particularly serious relationship. Arnold was young, working class, more interested in Alan's money than in Alan himself. But for Alan, who had spent most of his life alone, it must have felt like something. Then in January 1952, Alan's house was burgled. Some items were stolen. Nothing major, but enough to be upsetting. Alan reported the burglary to the police. During the investigation, Arnold's name came up. The police questioned Arnold, and under pressure, Arnold revealed that he and Alan had been in a sexual relationship. This was the moment that destroyed Alan Turing's life. He could have lied, he could have denied everything, but Alan was not someone who lied easily. When the police confronted him, he confirmed that yes, he had been in a relationship with Arnold Murray. He seemed almost relieved to be able to say it openly. He was arrested and charged with gross indecency under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. This was the same law that had been used to prosecute Oscar Wilde in 1895. The law was intentionally vague. Gross indecency could mean almost anything involving sexual contact between men. The penalty was up to 2 years of imprisonment with hard labor. Alan pleaded guilty. He didn't try to fight the charges. In court, he was offered a choice, prison or probation with mandatory treatment. The treatment was what we would now call chemical castration, a series of estrogen injections designed to suppress libido. The theory, such as it was that homosexuality was a disease caused by excessive male sex drive, and that flooding the body with female hormones would cure it. Alan chose the treatment. He wrote to a friend that he thought prison would be worse, that he might be able to continue his work if he avoided incarceration. The treatment began in April 1952 and continued for a year. The effects were humiliating and physically devastating. Alan developed breasts. He became impotent. He suffered from mood swings and depression. His body was being chemically altered against his nature. The physical changes were visible to everyone who knew him. Colleagues at Manchester noticed that his body was changing, that he seemed uncomfortable in his own skin. He tried to make jokes about it, told one friend that he was growing breasts and would soon need to shop in different sections of department stores, but the jokes had a brittle quality, a desperate attempt to maintain dignity in an undignified situation. He started wearing looser clothing to hide the changes to his body. He stopped going to the faculty common room as often, avoiding the stares and whispered conversations. The injections themselves were painful and degrading. Once a week, he had to report to a clinic, roll up his sleeve, and receive the estrogen. The nurses treated him with barely concealed contempt. Here was a convicted sex offender, a man who had done something so shameful that the law required him to be chemically altered. Alan endured these visits in silence, staring at the wall while the needle went in, counting down the weeks until the treatment would be over. But the worst consequences were professional. Alan's security clearance was revoked. He was barred from continuing any classified work. The government that had depended on him during the war, that had used his brilliance to break German codes and save British lives, now treated him as a security risk. He could no longer travel freely. There were concerns that he might be blackmailed by foreign agents, that his homosexuality made him vulnerable. When Alan applied for permission to travel to a mathematics conference in Switzerland, he was denied. When he wanted to visit a colleague in Amsterdam, the Home Office questioned why he needed to go abroad, whether there were security implications. Every trip required special permission, required explaining himself to officials who viewed him with suspicion. The man who had helped win the war could no longer be trusted to leave the country. Alan tried to continue his work. He still had his position at Manchester. He was still working on mathematical biology, still thinking about artificial intelligence. But the treatment had broken something in him. Friends who saw him during this period noted that he seemed diminished, less vibrant, more withdrawn. The man who had once run marathons, who had thrown himself into problems with boundless energy, now seemed tired and defeated. In the months after the treatment ended, there are signs that Alan was trying to rebuild his life. He travelled to Norway and Greece, trips that required special permission because of his criminal record. He continued his research. He saw friends, but there are also signs of deep unhappiness. He was isolated. The world he had helped save had rejected him. The work he loved had been taken from him. And then came June 7th, 1954. The coroner's inquest concluded that Alan had committed suicide. The evidence seemed clear: cyanide poisoning, a half-eaten apple by the bed, a man who had every reason to be depressed. The inquest heard testimony that Alan had made jokes about Snow White and the poisoned apple, that he had seemed in low spirits. The verdict was suicide while the balance of his mind was disturbed. But Alan's mother never accepted that verdict. She insisted that Alan's death was an accident, that he had been conducting chemistry experiments in the room next to his bedroom, that he had carelessly inhaled cyanide fumes without realizing the danger. She pointed out that the apple had never been tested for cyanide, that Alan often ate apples before bed, that there was no suicide note, no clear indication that he intended to kill himself. In 2012, Jack Copeland, a philosopher and Turing scholar, published a detailed analysis of the evidence. Copeland argued that the suicide verdict was based on assumptions rather than facts, that the evidence was equally consistent with accidental death. He noted that Alan had seemed in good spirits in the days before his death, that he had made plans for the future, that his last communications gave no hint of suicidal intent. Copeland concluded that we simply don't know how Alan Turing died, and perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. Alan spent his life asking questions that couldn't be fully answered, living with ambiguities that he couldn't resolve. The manner of his death, like so much else about him, remains a mystery. What we do know is this: Alan Turing died at age 41, at the height of his intellectual powers, with so much left undone. He died because the society he had served could not accept who he was. He died because laws written in Victorian times were still being used to prosecute men for the crime of loving other men. He died because Britain in 1954 valued conformity over genius, respectability over humanity. For decades after his death, Alan Turing was forgotten by all but a small circle of specialists. His wartime work remained classified. His contributions to computing were acknowledged in academic circles, but unknown to the general public. He was a footnote in the history of mathematics, a name in the credits of a story that Britain preferred not to tell. The declassification of Bletchley Park's work began in the 1970s. Slowly, the story emerged. Books were written, historians pieced together what had happened during the war, and Alan's role began to be recognized. But it was Andrew Hodges's 1983 biography, Alan Turing, The Enigma, that brought Alan's full story to public attention. Hodges didn't just describe Alan's mathematical work, he told the story of his life, including his homosexuality, including the prosecution and the chemical castration, including the circumstances of his death. The book created a new narrative. Alan Turing as tragic hero, the man who saved Britain and was destroyed by Britain's bigotry. It was a powerful story, and it was true in all the ways that mattered. But it also simplified. It made Alan into a symbol of gay persecution, of misunderstood genius, of the price of nonconformity. And symbols, however powerful, are always less complex than the people they represent. In the years since Hodges's biography, Alan has become an icon. There have been plays, films, novels. In 2009, Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued an official apology on behalf of the British government for Alan's prosecution. Brown's statement was remarkable. While Turing was dealt with under the law of the time, and we can't put the clock back, his treatment was of course utterly unfair, and I am pleased to have the chance to say how deeply sorry I and we all are for what happened to him. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Alan a posthumous royal pardon. This was controversial. Some argued that it was wrong to single out one man for pardon when thousands of others had been convicted under the same laws. But it was also a recognition that Alan's case was not like the others, that his contributions had been so extraordinary that his persecution was particularly shameful. In 2017, Parliament passed what became known as the Alan Turing Law, which pardoned all men convicted under historical laws criminalizing homosexuality. An estimated 65 EU men were affected. This was closer to real justice, not singling out one genius for special treatment, but acknowledging that the laws themselves had been wrong, that all the men prosecuted under them deserved to have their convictions erased. And in 2021, the Bank of England announced that Alan would appear on the new $50 note. His face, alongside images of his Turing machine and mathematical notation from his papers, would circulate throughout Britain. The man who had been prosecuted as a criminal was now honoured as a national hero. But even as Alan has been transformed into an icon, the popular understanding of what he actually did remains distorted. The story that most people know from movies like The Imitation Game, from simplified accounts in textbooks from the headlines about how one man's genius won the war, is wrong in important ways. Alan did not break Enigma alone. He built on Polish work. He collaborated with Gordon Welchman, Dilly Knox, Joan Clark, and thousands of others. His contribution was vital, but it was part of a massive collective effort. The narrative of the lone genius working in isolation is a myth, and it's a harmful myth because it obscures the reality of how intellectual breakthroughs actually happen. They happen through collaboration. They happen because someone builds on someone else's work. They happen because people with different skills and perspectives come together to solve problems that no one could solve alone. Alan was brilliant, but his brilliance was amplified by the context he worked in, by the people around him, by the institutional support that allowed him to focus on the problems that mattered. And the emphasis on Alan as war hero, while true, also obscures something important about his legacy. Alan's lasting contribution was not breaking Enigma. It was the theoretical work he did in 1936, the concept of the Turing machine, the proof that some problems are fundamentally unsolvable. That work laid the foundations for computer science. It shaped how we think about computation, about algorithms, about the limits of what computers can do. Every computer you interact with, every program you run, every algorithm that processes data, all of it rests on the conceptual framework that Alan established. He proved that computation could be formalized, that you could build a universal machine capable of running any program, that you could talk precisely about what was and wasn't computable. Without that theoretical foundation, the development of modern computing would have been impossible, and Alan's 1950 paper on machine intelligence was equally foundational. The Turing test remains the starting point for every serious discussion about artificial intelligence. When we ask whether large language models are truly intelligent, when we debate whether machines can think or feel or understand, we're still engaging with questions that Alan posed 70 years ago. His framework, pragmatic, focused on behavior rather than internal states, skeptical of philosophical objections, still shapes how researchers approach AI. The biological work Alan did in his final years was ahead of its time in ways that are only now being fully recognized. His reaction diffusion models are used in developmental biology, in understanding how patterns form in living systems, in modeling everything from skin pigmentation to the arrangement of leaves on a stem. He was thinking about biological computation before the field existed, asking how information encoded in genes gets translated into physical form. What's remarkable about Alan's morphogenesis work is how it connected to everything else he had done. He had spent years thinking about computation, about how complex behavior could emerge from simple rules, about how information could be processed and transformed. Now he was asking whether the same principles applied to living organisms. Could you understand the development of a zebra's stripes as a kind of computation, a biological algorithm running in the cells of the developing embryo? Could you model the growth of plants, the formation of patterns in shells and skin and fur as information processing systems? Alan approached morphogenesis the way he approached everything else, by stripping the problem down to essentials and building up from first principles. He proposed that you could get patterns from just two chemicals diffusing through space and reacting with each other. One chemical would activate growth, the other would inhibit it. The rates of diffusion and reaction would determine what patterns emerged. It seemed impossibly simple, but when Alan worked through the mathematics, he found that even these simple rules could generate complex, stable patterns that looked remarkably like those found in nature. He did this work alone in his house in Wilmslow, using the Manchester computer to run simulations. The computer was primitive by modern standards, slow, unreliable, with barely enough memory to handle the calculations. But it was enough. Alan would write programs to model his reaction diffusion systems, run them overnight, come in the morning to see what patterns had emerged. Sometimes the patterns were regular and periodic, like stripes or spots. Sometimes they were irregular and chaotic. Sometimes they were stable, persisting over time. Sometimes they were dynamic, evolving and changing. It was a glimpse of a new way of understanding life, of seeing living organisms as information processing systems running biological algorithms. This work was published in 1952, but it was largely ignored at the time. Biologists didn't have the mathematical background to understand it. Mathematicians didn't see why it was relevant to biology. It would be decades before researchers in developmental biology rediscovered Alan's work and realized how profound it was. Today, reaction diffusion models are a standard tool in understanding morphogenesis. Alan's name appears in textbooks on mathematical biology, in papers on pattern formation, in research on everything from how butterflies get their wing patterns to how neurons organize themselves in the developing brain. It's one more example of Alan seeing decades into the future, asking questions that wouldn't be answerable until long after his death. In each of these areas, mathematical logic, cryptanalysis, computing, artificial intelligence, mathematical biology, Alan saw connections that others missed. He took abstract concepts and made them concrete. He moved fluidly between theory and practice, between pure mathematics and engineering. He was not afraid to build things with his own hands when necessary. During the war, he soldered circuits himself, adjusted mechanical components, got his hands dirty making the bombs work. What unified all of Alan's work was a fundamental question: what can be computed? What problems can be solved mechanically by following a procedure? What are the limits of formal systems? This question connected his pre-war work on computability to his wartime cryptanalysis, to his post-war thinking about machine intelligence. For Alan, these were all variations on the same deep question about the nature of thought and calculation. And underneath that question was an even deeper one, the question that had haunted him since Christopher Morcom's death. What is mind? Does consciousness require biological substrate, or could it emerge from any sufficiently complex information processing system? If you could simulate a brain in sufficient detail, would that simulation be conscious? If a machine could pass for human in conversation, what would that tell us about the nature of humanity? Alan never answered these questions definitively. He couldn't. They're still open questions today, but he asked them with a precision and clarity that no one before him had managed. He took questions that had been the domain of philosophy and theology and made them tractable, made them into problems that could be approached systematically. And he did all of this while living in a society that criminalized his existence. He was a gay man in mid-20th century Britain, where homosexuality was not just illegal, but considered a mental illness, a moral failing, a sin. He could never be open about who he was. He could never live freely. Every relationship, every moment of intimacy carried the risk of exposure and prosecution. The psychological toll of this must have been immense, to be brilliant in ways that everyone recognizes, to have contributed things of lasting value, to have literally helped save your country from Nazi conquest, and then to be told that who you love makes you a criminal, that your nature is wrong, that you need to be cured through chemical castration. How do you reconcile those things? How do you maintain a sense of self-worth when the world tells you that you're fundamentally defective? We don't know what Alan thought about these questions. His letters from the period after his conviction are careful, guarded. He doesn't pour out his feelings. He makes jokes, discusses work, mentions trips he's planning. There's a terrible British reserve to it all, the stiff upper lip, the refusal to complain, the pretense that everything is fine even as his life is falling apart. But there are glimpses. In a letter to a friend, he mentions that the hormone treatment is making him grow breasts and that he'll soon be competing in a different athletic category. It's a joke, but a bitter one. In another letter, he expresses frustration at not being able to travel freely, at being treated as a security risk. These are small moments, but they reveal the strain he was under. What comes through in all the accounts from people who knew him is that Alan never became bitter. He didn't rage against the injustice of his treatment. He didn't become cynical or despairing, at least not outwardly. He kept working, kept thinking, kept pursuing the questions that interested him. There's something almost heroic about that, not the flashy heroism of wartime code-breaking, but the quiet heroism of continuing to do meaningful work even when the world has treated you monstrously. But heroism has its limits. No one can withstand that kind of pressure indefinitely. The psychological damage of being prosecuted, of being chemically castrated, of being treated as a threat to national security after having saved the nation, that damage accumulates. And perhaps on that June night in 1954 it became too much. Or perhaps it really was an accident, a moment of carelessness with dangerous chemicals. We'll never know. What we do know is that Alan Turing's death was preventable. If Britain had not criminalized homosexuality, if the laws had been different, if society had been capable of accepting that some people love differently, Alan would have lived. He might have continued working for decades. He might have made further contributions to computing, to artificial intelligence, to mathematical biology. We lost decades of potential work because Britain chose to enforce Victorian morality over human decency. And Alan was not the only one. Thousands of men were prosecuted under the same laws. Their lives were destroyed, their careers ended, their relationships torn apart. Most of them were not famous, most of them were ordinary people trying to live their lives, but they were all casualties of the same brutal system that killed Alan Turing. This is why Alan's story matters beyond his scientific contributions. He's become a symbol of how societies treat their minorities, of what happens when conformity is valued over humanity, of the cost of bigotry. His story asks uncomfortable questions. What are we doing now that future generations will look back on with horror? Who are we persecuting today with the same self-righteous certainty that Britain had when it prosecuted gay men? What brilliant contributions are we losing because we can't accept people who don't fit our expectations? These aren't historical questions. They're questions about the present. Every society believes it's more enlightened than the past, that it's moved beyond the prejudices of earlier generations. But that's what Britain thought in 1954 too. They thought they were modern, progressive, rational. And yet they destroyed one of their greatest minds because he loved men. Alan Turing's legacy is not just the Turing machine or the bomb or the Turing test. His legacy is also a warning about what we lose when we reject the people who don't conform. He should have lived into old age. He should have seen the development of modern computing, should have watched his ideas about artificial intelligence become reality, should have witnessed the revolution in mathematical biology that his morphogenesis work helped spark. Instead, he died at 41, alone in a suburban house, his potential unrealized. But his ideas survived. They outlived the bigotry that killed him. They outlived the officials who prosecuted him. They outlived the laws that criminalized him. And as those ideas continue to shape our world, as computers become more powerful and AI becomes more sophisticated, and we continue grappling with questions about the nature of intelligence and consciousness, Alan Turing remains present. Not as a saint, not as a perfect hero, not as the lone genius who single-handedly won the war. Those narratives do him no favors. But as a complex, brilliant, flawed human being who asked better questions than anyone else, who saw possibilities that others missed, who refused to accept that anything was impossible until he'd proven it so, the real Alan Turing is more interesting than the myth. He was collaborative, not solitary. He was practical as well as theoretical. He built things with his hands. He ran marathons. He chained his mug to the radiator. He proposed to a woman even though he was gay because he cared about her and wanted to make a life work. He broke off the engagement because he couldn't live a lie. He reported a burglary to the police even though he must have known it might expose his relationship with Arnold Murray. He chose chemical castration over prison because he wanted to keep working. He continued doing mathematics and biology even after the treatment devastated him. He died, possibly by his own hand, possibly by accident, but definitely because the world couldn't make room for who he was. And now, 70 years after his death, his face is on the $50 note. The Bank of England chose a gay man who died after being chemically castrated, to represent Britain on its currency. They chose him over countless other British scientists and thinkers. They chose him knowing his full story, knowing what Britain did to him. It's an extraordinary gesture, a national act of contrition, but it's also insufficient. No honor, no matter how great, can undo what was done. The apology came 55 years too late. The pardon came 59 years too late. Alan Turing is dead, and all the recognition in the world can't bring him back. What we can do is learn from what happened. We can recognize that genius doesn't excuse persecution, that no scientific contribution makes up for a life destroyed. We can acknowledge that Alan Turing was failed by his country, by the laws, by the society that should have protected him. We can tell his story accurately, not as myth, but as history, not as inspiration porn, but as tragedy and triumph intertwined. And we can ask ourselves what Alan would have wanted. Not the statue or the apology or the 50-note probably. Those would have seemed strange to him, excessive. What Alan wanted was to keep working. He wanted to solve problems. He wanted to understand how minds work and whether machines could think and how biological patterns emerge. He wanted to be left alone to pursue the questions that fascinated him. That's what Britain took from him, not just his freedom or his dignity, but his ability to work, to think, to contribute. When they revoked his security clearance, when they made him a pariah, when they broke his body with hormones, they took away the thing that mattered most to him. And in doing so, they impoverished themselves. They lost decades of potential contributions from one of the greatest minds their nation had produced. This is the real tragedy of Alan Turing. Not that he was persecuted, though he was, not that he died young, though he did, but that we'll never know what he might have accomplished if he'd been allowed to live freely, to love openly, to work without the weight of prosecution and chemical castration bearing down on him. We'll never know what papers he might have written, what machines he might have built, what questions he might have asked. All we have is what he managed to accomplish in the 41 years he had under conditions that would have broken most people. And what he accomplished in that abbreviated life was remarkable enough to change the world. The computer you're using to read this, watch this, interact with this, it exists because Alan Turing formalized what computation meant. The AI systems that are reshaping our economy and culture, they exist because Alan Turing asked whether machines could think. The mathematical models that help us understand biological development, they exist because Alan Turing applied pure mathematics to living systems. Every part of our modern technological world bears his fingerprints. He is everywhere and nowhere, present in the devices we use, in the algorithms that shape our lives, in the questions we ask about artificial intelligence and consciousness, but absent from the conversations, dead for 70 years, unable to see what became of his ideas. The question he asked at the beginning of his 1950 paper remains, can machines think? We still don't have a definitive answer. We have machines that can pass crude versions of the Turing test. We have AI systems that can write essays, compose music, generate images, hold conversations. But do they think? Do they understand? Do they have any internal experience, any consciousness, any genuine intelligence? Or are they just sophisticated pattern-matching systems, impressive, but ultimately empty? Alan would have loved these questions. He would have been fascinated by modern AI, by large language models, by the philosophical debates they've sparked. He would have asked precise questions about what these systems can and can't do, about how we should test them, about what it would mean if they truly were intelligent. He would have pushed past the hype and the fear and gotten to the technical reality underneath. And he would have done so with the same combination of rigor and playfulness that characterized all his work. He would have taken it seriously without taking himself too seriously. He would have built things, tested things, gotten his hands dirty. He would have collaborated with others, shared ideas freely, rejected the notion that genius requires isolation. This is what we lost when Alan Turing died. Not just a brilliant individual, but a way of approaching problems, curious, rigorous, practical, unafraid of hard questions. We lost someone who could move between pure abstraction and concrete engineering, who could see connections that others missed, who could make the impossible seem obvious once you understood it properly. We lost all that because Britain couldn't accept that he was gay. That's what it comes down to, not his eccentricity, not his social awkwardness, not anything about his personality or behavior that harmed anyone. Just the fact that he loved men. For that he was prosecuted. For that he was chemically castrated. For that he died. This is why Alan Turing's story can't be separated from his sexuality. Some people want to focus only on his achievements, to celebrate his genius without dwelling on his persecution. But you can't understand Alan without understanding what he survived, what he endured, what ultimately killed him. His homosexuality wasn't incidental to his story. It was central to it. It shaped how he moved through the world, who he could trust, what risks he could take. It cost him relationships, security, ultimately his life. And it makes his achievements all the more remarkable. He did what he did while carrying that burden, while living with the constant awareness that exposure meant prosecution, while knowing that the society he served considered him a criminal. Most people, under that kind of pressure, would not have accomplished a fraction of what Alan did. The fact that he managed to do groundbreaking work in multiple fields while living under that threat is extraordinary. But we shouldn't have to celebrate people for overcoming oppression. We should be outraged that oppression existed in the first place. Alan Turing shouldn't be inspirational because he accomplished great things despite being persecuted. He should be a cautionary tale about what societies lose when they persecute people for who they are. How many other Alan Turings were destroyed before they could contribute anything? How many brilliant minds were broken by laws that criminalized their existence? How many people never got the chance to show what they could do because society rejected them before they could begin? We'll never know. They're lost to history, casualties of bigotry that seemed righteous at the time. This is the question Alan Turing's story forces us to confront. What are we doing now that future generations will condemn? Who are we failing to protect? What contributions are we losing because we can't accept people who challenge our assumptions about how life should be lived? These questions don't have easy answers, but they need to be asked, because the alternative is to repeat the mistakes of the past, to destroy more Alan Turings, to impoverish our future for the sake of enforcing conformity in the present. Alan Turing was not a saint. He was a person. Complicated, flawed, brilliant, vulnerable. He made mistakes. He could be thoughtless about other people's feelings. He was not always easy to work with. His social awkwardness was real, not just a charming quirk. He hurt people sometimes, not out of malice, but out of obliviousness to social norms. But he was also generous with his ideas, willing to share credit, eager to collaborate. He was patient with people who didn't understand mathematics as quickly as he did. He formed deep friendships that lasted years. He was loyal to the people he cared about. He tried to be honest, even when honesty was dangerous. And he spent his life asking questions that mattered, not just to him, not just to mathematicians, but questions that touch on what it means to be human. Can machines think? What is intelligence? How does mind emerge from matter? What can be computed and what lies forever beyond computation? These are not abstract academic questions. They're questions about who we are and what our place is in a world increasingly shaped by technology we've created. Alan didn't answer these questions definitively. He couldn't. They're still open, still being debated, still driving research in computer science and philosophy and neuroscience. But he asked them in ways that made them tractable, that turned them from philosophical puzzles into scientific problems. He gave us frameworks for thinking about computation and intelligence that remain foundational 70 years later. And he did so while living in a world that was hostile to his existence. That's the part we can't forget. His brilliance wasn't separate from his struggle. It was shaped by it, deepened by it, made more remarkable by the context in which it emerged. The cold open to this story was Alan's death, the half-eaten apple, the cyanide, the suburban house in Wilmslow. But that's not where his story ends. His story ends in every computer, every algorithm, every AI system, every mathematical model of biological patterns. His story ends in the questions we're still asking about machine intelligence, in the debates about what consciousness means, in the ongoing attempts to formalize what can and can't be computed. Alan Turing is not historical. He's present. His ideas are alive in ways that most people don't recognize because they've become so fundamental to how we think about technology. When you use a computer, you're using a physical instantiation of the Turing machine. When you interact with AI, you're engaging with questions that Alan asked first. When you wonder whether machines can really think or just simulate thinking, you're following paths that Alan mapped out. He won't leave us alone. His questions keep coming back, keep demanding answers we don't have yet. Can machines think? We still don't know. What is intelligence? We're still figuring it out. How does consciousness emerge? We're still investigating. What are the limits of computation? We're still discovering them. These are Alan's questions, and they're our inheritance. He gave us the tools to approach them systematically, to make progress on problems that once seemed hopelessly philosophical. And he paid an enormous price for doing so, not because of the work itself, but because of who he was while doing it. Britain has apologized, the Queen has pardoned him, his face is on the currency. These gestures matter, but they don't undo what was done. Alan Turing is still dead at 41. Those years he might have lived, the work he might have done, the questions he might have asked, they're lost forever. What we can do is remember accurately, not the myth of the lone genius who won the war alone. That's a disservice to Alan and to everyone who worked with him. But the reality of a brilliant, complicated man who collaborated with others to break seemingly unbreakable codes, who laid theoretical foundations that made modern computing possible, who asked questions about machine intelligence before computers could do more than basic arithmetic, who endured persecution with dignity, and who died far too young because his country couldn't accept him. That's the story that matters. Not the simplified version, not the sanitized hero's tale, but the full, complex, difficult truth. Alan Turing was human. Flawed, brilliant, vulnerable, persistent. He saw further than most people, but not infinitely far. He made contributions that changed the world, but he did so with help, building on others' work. He was destroyed by bigotry, but he wasn't defined by his victimhood. He kept working, kept thinking, kept asking questions until the very end. And those questions are still with us. Can machines think? We're finding out. What does it mean to be intelligent? We're still learning. How do patterns emerge from simple rules? We're still exploring. What are the limits of what can be computed? We're still testing them. Alan Turing gave us these questions. He gave us the tools to approach them. He gave us a vision of what might be possible if we took computation seriously as a fundamental concept, as basic, as number, or set, or function. And then he was taken from us, his life cut short by laws that had no place in a just society. The tragedy is not just that he died young. The tragedy is that we let it happen, that Britain, the nation he helped save, turned on him, that the institutions he served destroyed him, that the full force of law and social sanction was brought to bear on a man whose only crime was loving men. We can't undo that. We can't bring Alan back. We can't give him the life he deserved. All we can do is remember, accurately and completely. Remember what he contributed and what was done to him. Remember that genius doesn't protect you from persecution. Remember that scientific brilliance doesn't excuse social bigotry. Remember that every unjust law has a human cost, and sometimes that cost is incalculable. Alan Turing should have lived. He should have seen his ideas bloom into the computer revolution. He should have witnessed artificial intelligence develop from speculation into reality. He should have grown old, should have continued working, should have asked new questions and found new answers. Instead, he died at 41, alone, his potential unfulfilled. But his questions remain. They won't let us go. They keep demanding answers, keep pushing us to think harder about computation and intelligence and consciousness. Alan Turing is gone, but his absence is loud. It echoes in every computer, every algorithm, every AI system. It asks, "What did you lose when you destroyed me? What might I have given you if you'd let me live?" We'll never know the answer to that question. We only know what we lost. And that loss, that senseless, preventable loss, is the real tragedy at the heart of Alan Turing's story. Not that he died, but that he was killed. Not that he suffered, but that his suffering was deliberate, sanctioned, legal. Not that we forgot him, but that we destroyed him and then, decades later, pretended to honor his memory while the systems that killed him remained largely unchanged. Alan Turing deserved better. He deserved to live, to work, to love freely. He deserved a society that valued his contributions without demanding that he hide who he was. He deserved justice, not belated apologies. He deserved life, not martyrdom. We owe him more than remembrance. We owe him action, the work of building a world where the next Alan Turing doesn't face prosecution for being different, doesn't have to choose between prison and chemical castration, doesn't die at 41 because society couldn't make room for who they were. That work isn't finished. It may never be finished, But as long as we're asking Alan's questions, as long as we're building on his foundations, as long as we're grappling with the problems he posed, we're continuing the conversation he started. We're keeping faith with his legacy, not by idealizing him, but by taking his ideas seriously and learning from how he was treated. Alan Turing was not the man who won the war alone. He was one mathematician among thousands, building on Polish breakthroughs, collaborating with brilliant colleagues, contributing vital pieces to a massive collective effort. But he was also the man who formalized what computation means, who asked whether machines could think, who laid foundations that we're still building on 70 years later. He was both of those things, collaborative team member and visionary theorist, practical engineer, an abstract thinker, war hero and persecution victim, brilliant mind and vulnerable human being. The story of his life is not simple. It's not a clean arc from obscurity to triumph. It's complicated, contradictory, unresolved in crucial ways. We don't know how he died. We don't know what he might have become. We don't know whether he found peace or died in despair. What we do know is that he asked better questions than anyone else. And those questions are still with us, still unanswered, still demanding our attention. Can machines think? We're finding out, slowly building AI systems that challenge our assumptions about what intelligence means. What can be computed? We're still discovering the boundaries, still exploring what lies beyond algorithmic solution. How does mind emerge from matter? We're still investigating using tools that descend directly from Alan's work. These are not just technical questions, they're questions about who we are, what makes us human, what our place is in a world we're transforming through technology. And they're Alan Turing's questions, the ones he asked first, the ones he gave us frameworks for approaching, the ones he never got to see answered because he was destroyed by a bigoted society before his time. That's the story. Not the myth of the lone genius, but the reality of the collaborative brilliance. Not the simplified hero's journey, but the complex tragedy of genius destroyed by bigotry. Not the reassuring tale of talent recognized, but the disturbing truth of contributions made despite persecution. Life cut short by laws that had no place in a just world. Alan Turing won't let us forget these questions. He won't let us pretend they've been answered. He remains present in every computer, every algorithm, every debate about AI and consciousness and the limits of computation. His absence is loud, his questions echo, and we're still trying to answer them, still building on foundations he laid, still following paths he traced 70 years ago. The codebreaker who didn't win the war alone, the mathematician who formalized computation, the man destroyed by his own country. The questions that won't be silenced, the legacy that survives persecution, the tragedy that keeps asking, what did you lose when you destroyed me? We lost everything Alan Turing might have been. We lost decades of potential contributions. We lost the questions he might have asked next, the problems he might have solved, the insights he might have shared. We lost a future that could have been different if we'd been capable of accepting him as he was. That loss is permanent. But his questions remain. And as long as we're asking them, as long as we're building on his work, as long as we're grappling with the problems he posed, Alan Turing is not gone. He's here, in the machines we've built, in the questions we're asking, in the future we're creating. Present, persistent, impossible to ignore. Can machines think? We're still finding out. And every step we take toward an answer, we're walking a path that Alan Turing cleared for us 70 years ago in a world that killed him for who he loved. That's his legacy, not the simplified myth, but the complex, difficult, brilliant reality. Questions that won't be answered, ideas that won't die, a presence that refuses to fade. Alan Turing, 1912 to 1954. 41 years. Not nearly enough time. but enough to change everything.